Welcome to Canonical, a conversation about books. I'm James Xiao, and I'm joined by Yed Darris.
Hello.
Hey, Yed. And Sam Spieler.
Hi.
Today we are continuing our series on pandemic literature with Emily St. John Mandel's Station 11. So Sam, can you start us off by talking about the book and why you chose it?
Sure. Emily St. John Mandel is a Canadian writer from the west coast of British Columbia, which informs some of this book, though she lives in New York currently. She just published her most recent book, The Glass Hotel, a couple months ago. Station 11, what we're discussing today, was her fourth of 5 novels so far. It was published in 2014. It had huge critical and audience acclaim. It was lauded by just about everyone. It won several awards, such as the Arthur C. Clarke Award, and it was a finalist for both the National Book Award and PEN/Faulkner Award. I don't remember exactly when I first heard about it, maybe a year ago or so, but while I love post-apocalyptic fiction, the premise I'd first read, that it was about a Shakespearean acting troupe on some sort of mission, didn't really appeal to me. I was reminded of the book a few months ago, though, right before we started this podcast, when I was looking for science fiction suggestions, and this popped up. And I've met a few people since this year that raved about it unprompted. I'm glad I looked it back up because while that vague premise isn't completely wrong, it's about a lot more than that, too.
I saw that line as well, the Shakespearean acting troupe. That obviously is not a good description of the book. Because it's more than that, right?
Right. That's like a fifth of the book, maybe.
Right, or even less. I mean, it's so. What would it be like if you had to write a one-sentence summary or a review of the book? What would it be?
It's tough. It's a book that takes place over the span of. Well, that's hard.
Yeah. Do you want to attempt a one-sentence summary or a one-sentence review?
You can say it's a post-pandemic, post-apocalyptic novel that shifts through time and space and is following actors before and after the pandemic.
What would your one-sentence review be?
It's very well done in terms of the type of thing that it is, but it's a type of thing that I don't really like. It's like if you have somebody who really likes espresso and you offer him a really nice cup of iced coffee, he's going to say, wow, this is good iced coffee, but I still prefer espresso.
What about you, Sam?
I think that's a pretty good description. I definitely enjoyed it. I can see the strings behind things. I can understand what she's going for. And I think she did a pretty good job, but it's not, her style is not really my style. So even though it was a fun read, I didn't love it the way I felt like I should.
I guess if I were to give my one sentence, it'd be some kind of cliched simile, comparing it to a fluffy dessert, where it's tasty, and while you're eating it, you kind of enjoy it, but it won't leave you full.
I have the feeling that I'll recommend it to some people, but as kind of a summer read. You know, it's light and airy, like you said. But I also do think there's things that I missed or didn't consider while reading that, looking back on it, I can see, okay, I can see where that would have come from.
You know, and I'm hesitant when I say that as well, because, and this goes to something you want to talk about, Sam, which is like, this is a genre novel. And I'm hesitant because there's this perception that genre novels are light and fluffy, like they're not very substantial. And as someone who loves genre, it really kind of pains me to kind of describe this book in such a way.
Well, let's get into it. There was some classification hand-wringing when this was published. You say genre fiction. I don't really know. I think it's a lot of different things, or it could be a lot of different things. And that actually is part of my problem. with the book.
Well, what do you mean by that? What's the problem?
The problem for me personally is that it feels like it's trying to do a lot of different things. And I feel like it does all of those things, but it does so in a very broad overview sort of way. That, like, I feel like we're getting overtures of different things, but we're not getting the deep dive.
I think in that sense, you could say it's more of a pastiche rather than a genuine exploration of any particular genre. It just uses the trappings of certain genres.
So, yeah, did you feel the same way as Sam? Did you feel like this was a book that relied on different genre elements, but was not itself wholly in one genre or another?
I think that genres aren't so mutually exclusive. I think that this does comfortably fit into a few genres. I think you can call it literary fiction. I think you can call it speculative fiction. I don't really see them in conflict with each other. I don't also think of those terms as evaluative terms. If I say that this is literary fiction, it doesn't mean that it's good. It just means that that's where it belongs. If I say it's speculative, it doesn't mean to me that it's anything in particular. It's just that's where it fits based on the type of story that's inside of the novel.
That goes along with what Mandel said about that categorization. She said, my only objection to these categories is that when you have a book like mine that doesn't fit neatly into any category, there's a real risk that readers who only read literary fiction won't pick it up because they think they couldn't possibly like sci-fi, while sci-fi readers will pick up the book based on the sci-fi categorization and then be disappointed because the book isn't sci-fi enough. And I feel, I agree. I think she's right. But yeah, I don't know. I had the same issue, but not for the same reasons. I think I did come into it with some expectations, but I'm not a reader like she describes, where I only read this or I only read that.
Yeah.
And yet I still had issues with this borrowing lightly from different things, but not settling in any one.
Well, like I said before, I don't particularly care if it is sci-fi or not, but I want to just be on the record as saying it's definitely not sci-fi.
I agree with you, Ed, in that it doesn't matter for me either. I don't care. And I also think that's a terrible question. Like, I really would wish that reviewers and publicists and interviewers stop asking that question, because it doesn't matter outside of sales. Yeah. And obviously it matters because of sales. But like, it's a terrible question to ask a writer, because writers honestly don't give a shit.
It's like asking a band what kind of music they play.
Yeah. Yeah, like, you ask someone that question, they're going to give you a stupid response because it's a stupid question.
Yeah.
I mean, and I read, perhaps, I think it was a separate interview where she expressed some angst about her first 3 novels being crime thrillers, and she was worried that she'd be pigeonholed as a crime thriller, as a thriller writer. And that's probably what led to the question by the interviewer, because he figured it was a softball question for her to answer. Mm-hmm. I understand that as something a young writer might struggle with, because they don't want their opportunities limited, especially if they think of genre as maybe not as prestigious. But I didn't like that she said that, because I feel like it denigrates crime writing or thrillers, because I think a crime novel can be as good as a literary fiction novel if done by a competent writer. And speaking of which, I actually saw a lot of mystery elements here, so take that, Emily St. John Mandel, because, like, for example, all the objects she has in the novel, they kind of have a mystery around them, and you don't know where they come from. It's really reminiscent of a lot of mystery novels where you have clues. A lot of meaning is attached to these objects, right? Like a bloody knife, or a certain detail, like this person left the apartment at X time. So she has those elements in the book, and she's really good at heightening tension and suspense. So I definitely see mystery elements in this novel, even if she's trying to get away from that.
I can think of a number of them, but what objects stuck out to you?
For me, the obvious mystery was the origin of Station 11, the comic book, and I've been thinking about what meaning it might hold. So I'm curious to see if you guys had some ideas on this, on what Station 11 actually means. But for me, the station and the undersea is kind of like paralleled by post-pandemic and pre-pandemic. You have society, right, Station 11, pre-pandemic, but that character, Dr. 11, goes to the undersea, which is kind of this, it's like a hellish world, which is the world post-pandemic. That's how I saw that.
The way I see it is that Mandel intended for Station 11 to have two different kind of fields of meaning. First, it would have a meaning for Miranda before the pandemic, and I think that it was probably something related to maybe being controlled by men. First, her boyfriend Pablo, I think it is, and then probably being controlled by Arthur. And then after the pandemic, it has a separate meaning for Kirsten in terms of the longing for a different life that you'd mentioned. I don't think it's entirely successful. I think it has a much stronger connection to the post-pandemic world that Kristen lives in rather than the pre-pandemic world that Miranda lives in.
Yeah, one reason why I feel similarly is because the post-pandemic world, especially the immediate 1 or 2 weeks after the flu started spreading, was the most interesting part of the book for me. The pre-pandemic world, I just didn't find it interesting at all, honestly.
I agree. I saw some people that felt the opposite, but yeah, I totally agree.
Here's a craft question. She opens the novel with Jivan, the new paramedic, and I thought that he was the least interesting character in the whole thing. And at the beginning of the novel, I really wasn't into it because of Jivan. I didn't really care about him at all.
Yeah.
Why do you think she put him at the beginning?
I don't know. So I kept thinking that he was going to become more important than he was.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you, Ed. I don't know why she started with Jivan. I suspect it's because Jivan is someone who's trying to change, and the pandemic allows him to become a new person, a better person, because he's struggling with his life choice of being a paparazzo, and he ends up being a doctor post-pandemic. And so even though life has gotten measurably worse, his life attainment is much better. I guess he's much more satisfied with his life. That's kind of why I see him as starting off the novel, because he kind of sets that tone. But I agree, like, it's not a very engaging start.
I think she did it probably just because she was enthralled with this kind of mechanic of starting with the death of a central character and then flashing back to when he was still alive, because she does handle the flashbacks very well, and I think that it's a very good thing to do. It makes the novel very engaging, but I think she wanted to start from when Arthur was alive, but didn't know how to start with Arthur himself. So she started with this adjacent character rather than starting with the death of Arthur from Arthur's own perspective.
But I did enjoy the description of Jivan and his brother as they tried to survive the immediate post-pandemic world. Like, that for me was really real. The whole stockpiling of food, how they were just kind of seeing what was going on from their apartment. Like, that felt really real and immediate to me.
His brother was much more interesting to me.
I enjoyed that section too, but I still felt, even though it was detailed, that too felt like an overview for me. I feel like every moment in the book, even when it was descriptive, I felt like I wanted more, at least from the sections that I enjoyed. And I didn't feel like I ever really got that from any given character's perspective. Like, I was never fully satisfied.
Did you want more description, or did you want more meaning attached to what was going on?
I think I wanted more meaning, but that goes back to what I said earlier about that maybe I was wrong, maybe I just didn't see it until after reading and had a chance to think about it more. But while reading, there's this whole thing that she avoids. I think we've all read a lot of apocalyptic fiction. Apocalyptic fiction has now become literary fiction. Taken with a book like The Road by Cormac McCarthy, that's all about the really gritty details in the moment of the apocalypse. But I think Mandel was not interested in that. I think she wanted to avoid that completely. And so we only get little details from the apocalypse itself. Most of it comes before and after. And that's fine. That's her mission. But even then, I still felt like it was light.
James, to go back to something you said earlier about Station 11 being a mystery novel, I think that works for me in terms of the fact that a lot of mystery fiction involves reveals where keys to the story are revealed at pivotal moments, and it often hinges on coincidences. And I saw so many coincidences in this novel. My question here just basically is, how many coincidences is too many coincidences? Because I felt personally that there were way too many.
The big one, right, in terms of coincidences, the big one is the Prophet and Kirsten, right? And spoiler alert, they're both related in some way or connected to Arthur.
They're both children of Arthur.
Yes.
One literal and one figurative.
Yeah, that is a huge, huge coincidence, and it's problematic for me.
I think one huge coincidence is okay, but there are many other minor coincidences. The fact they both had the Station 11 comic books, the fact that the two people who knew Arthur very well were traveling on the same airplane when it got diverted into Severn City. They're just building up piece by piece, and I just felt that there's a certain magic of the novel that Mandel achieves by having everything fit into place, but when it fits into place, because there was so much, I don't know if I want to say it's fakery, but it's just so much, I don't know. She's pulling the strings too sharply, I guess, is what I would say. It's obviously contrived.
What's interesting is that they have that discussion in the book. When Tyler and his mom are still in Severn City Airport, Clark has a conversation with Tyler about why they're alive, why they specifically have been spared, in Tyler's way of looking at it. And Clark tries to impress on him that it's just a coincidence. It's just, we got lucky. And that's a very nihilistic and entropic view of it. Nihilistic, not in a negative sense, but just in this is a universe of entropy, and we just got lucky. But Tyler takes a deterministic view, and that's where his whole cult comes from, that he was chosen, that all of them were chosen, and that he's going to lead them to the afterlife, to heaven.
Did you feel like there were too many coincidences?
I did. From a writer's standpoint, I remember Ha Jin saying once that you can only have one coincidence in a short story, and for a novel it was also low, like 2 or 3 maybe. And yeah, I always took that to heart, and this book, like you had said, is full of coincidences.
The only issue I had with the coincidence of Kirsten and the Prophet is the fact that they both survived independent of each other. In a world where 99 point whatever % of people die, the two of them both survive. That's why it's such a huge coincidence. It can't be explained in any other way. Like, you can't explain it away. And in this post-apocalyptic world, they run into each other, and one is the antagonist and one is the protagonist. Mm-hmm. It's just too much for me. The problem with Clark and what's her name? Tyler's mother, Elizabeth. That actually reminds me of something I read before, which is like when you have these kinds of coincidences, it actually happens in real life. I mean, in a book, yes, it stands out, but in real life, it happens a lot because New York is a hub and they're all flying to Toronto because Arthur died. So there is a reason why they're going to Toronto. There are only a limited number of flights. So like these kinds of coincidences actually do happen all the time in real life. And people think, oh, how unlikely. But actually it's quite common because they have the same goal. And they have to transit through the same hub. Like I think it was actually in Freakonomics where they talk about this.
Sam, you had asked about Clark's opinion of the coincidence and Tyler's opinion of the coincidence. I don't know that either of them are very compelling. I think that Clark's view is much more naive to just say, oh, well, it happened. Tyler's view is like we were chosen by God for a reason. I think that whether or not you would accept that as a compelling argument depends on how religious you are. And for me, as a non-religious person, I would say, well, it's not compelling at all because I don't believe in the worldview that argument is founded on. So I don't see how a reader who isn't religious could be compelled by that argument.
That kind of goes to the heart of my question. The reason why I asked, are these coincidences? Is Clark's view that these are just coincidences or Tyler's view that we're fated to survive? Is either of these a compelling argument? The reason I'm asking is because Clark's view is the view of the book, but Tyler's view is kind of this straw man argument where, like you said, the only people that are going to agree with that are the people that are religious and believe in fate. But at the same time, I don't know that Clark's argument works either. It works for the book, and it works in the sense that, James, you were just describing how people on an airplane frequently have these kinds of coincidences where they run into people they know. But in light of fiction, when we have a book full of coincidences, not just the airplane, not just the fact that a lot of characters that knew each other 20 years ago have all found each other in the same airport or the same general region. But that out of 99.99% of people dying, these are the ones that survive. Yeah, I don't think either argument is compelling. I don't think they fully make sense.
There's something here about, I want to say, code switching. But it's not exactly code switching. It's more about expectations, I guess, in that we talked about genre earlier. In mystery novels, which I'm a huge fan of, like I read a lot of mystery novels, the reason why a certain murder gets committed, oftentimes, if you just take it out of the book, it seems ridiculous. Like, this person wants to kill that person because of his inheritance, because he had to kill him at that time before this time, and she will get it if he doesn't, all this stuff. It's so convoluted and ridiculous. But in the book, there's some legerdemain, like the writer tricks you into believing it. I feel like she's trying to do it here, and I feel like mystery writers will totally just go along with it, in that Tyler becomes this crazed prophet and becomes evil, and people who are attuned to this kind of mode of writing will just accept it. But because we come to this book after reading Blindness, which really calls into question the motives of why people do things, it just comes across as so shallow. It's the juxtaposition of Blindness to this book that makes me feel like the rationale here just doesn't fly.
I was thinking the same thing, not about coincidence, but about style in general, that Blindness's style spoke to me a lot more than this did. And I feel like maybe that was why I didn't agree with this as much, that maybe if I had read this on its own, completely separate, maybe I would have been more receptive to it. What about you, Ed? Did you have any feelings about reading this right after Blindness?
I think it's clear to me that Blindness is a superior novel, to my taste at least. It has more meaningful things to say about people in general, And it has a more honest way of dealing with the reader and the way that the reader approaches the novel. I think that there is a satisfaction that the reader gets when we see a puzzle piece fall into place and it fits perfectly and you say, oh, yes, that's where it was meant to go. But I think with Blindness, even though the narrative is a little bit messier than Station 11, because it has more of a direct representational quality in terms of representing my lived experience, it hits me on a much more substantial level than Station 11. Station 11 remained on the level of artifice. It remained on the level of a very skillful storyteller telling a very complicated story rather than speaking to anything human.
I do want to kind of just highlight the last part, though, yet, because it sounds like we're all bashing the book, where, in fact, it is a really well-written, well-plotted book. Like, the prose is fine, and the plot is pretty good. Multiple points of view are handled pretty well.
No, definitely. Mandel is a skilled writer. Like, in terms of managing all of the different points of view and the different narratives, she's very, very skillful. I don't want to shortchange her. I'm just saying that maybe what she was trying to do is very different from what Saramago was trying to do. So maybe the comparison isn't really as fruitful as we might expect.
So we talked about Jeevan earlier, and I think I agree that he was a weak place to start. What did you think about the characters?
I mentioned earlier that Arthur is kind of the main character, but he's not in a lot of sections of the novel. There's just so many characters. I feel like my attention was spread pretty thin. Did you guys really care about these characters? Did they matter to you?
I felt they were believable. I felt like I understood where they were coming from for the most part, but I don't know that I cared about any of them. I was more invested in Kirsten's story than most of them, but yeah, I don't know that care would be the right word.
I was pretty invested as well in all the characters, the least of which was Arthur. And I think partly because he doesn't survive the pandemic, and nothing of his really survives unless you count his progeny as surviving, I guess. Whereas, you had the actual comic book surviving. So that's something that, what's her name? Sorry.
Miranda.
The first, Miranda, yeah. So something of Miranda survives, and you can draw that link. Whereas she tries really hard to make Arthur the central figure, but I just don't know why. Like, I just don't see the point.
I think that ties into the objects. One of the reasons why I wanted to talk about objects in this book is she focuses on various objects quite a bit, and there's a big difference between what survives the apocalypse and what doesn't. And Arthur is the central figure to which all the other characters are connected, but he's definitely the most famous. He's a Hollywood actor. He's pulled all these people together. There's this book about him that comes out right before the flu takes hold. But that book is overshadowed by the flu. All the characters are worried about this book coming out. And then it does, and it doesn't matter because the flu destroys everything. So that book might as well not exist. But when everything in the world has been destroyed, one of the things that doesn't just survive, but ends up being passed around to the point where it, at the end of the book, it has a place in the Museum of Civilization, is a comic book that never existed before. There's 2 copies of it in existence. There's a message in there about what matters and what doesn't, or what we think should survive versus what actually does survive.
So Sam, I'm still confused. Like, why does Arthur matter at all? Because you told me why the comic book matters, which I totally agree, but why does Arthur matter in the context of this book?
My point in bringing that up is I think maybe that Arthur is the reason that all of these people are connected. So he's the centerpiece, but while he's important in the world before, he is not important in the world after. He's the one that should have a legacy in the way we think of legacies. But in a post-apocalypse world, he just doesn't matter. Hollywood doesn't matter. Acting is a central point. So as an art form, that becomes a very important thing that survives. But Arthur's legacy doesn't.
I think I disagree with you, Sam. I think that he matters, but not as a human being. I think after the apocalypse, he becomes kind of a totem. He becomes a symbol of the pre-pandemic society. And Kristen especially is very attracted to him just because she has this faint memory of working with him in Toronto, but he is a symbol of mass media and just the comforts of life before the pandemic.
Why do you think Mandel spends so much time on his background, his rags to riches kind of story? I mean, what does that have to do with the rest of the book?
I think, like what Sam said, is that Arthur doesn't matter so much in and of himself. He's more of the hub from which the other spokes of the wheel kind of radiate. But I think that she was worried about making him just a mere kind of hub, just this mere connection between somebody like Clark and Miranda. She wanted to make their connection more substantial, and in order to make their connection substantial, she built up Arthur. But I don't think Arthur ever resulted in a character that was compelling in and of himself.
Well, this is also a book about journeys, right? We have 5 main characters, arguably. We've got Arthur, Jeevan, Kirsten, Miranda, and Clark. And they all go through their own personal arcs. They all go through a major change. Arthur's happens before the pandemic begins. But they all have an arc of some sort, and I think she wanted to make sure that each character had nearly equal weight as far as that arc goes.
I'm not sure. I feel like Kirsten, I always switch back and forth, but
Kirsten.
Yeah, I think Kirsten has more of an active role in the novel, only because we see her doing things kind of in the present tense, whereas when we open the novel, we already know Arthur is dead. So even though we flash back in time and we see him living, we do see him living with the knowledge that his time is coming up, you know? So I feel like he's not as engaging, at least to me, as Kirsten is.
Well, it's a tough comparison, too, because Kirsten's story is all about action. It's about survival. And a really tough survival. You know, she's got these tattoos that show she's had to kill 2 people, and by the end of the book, 3, I think. She's the only character that we see go through things like that. Jeevan sort of does, but it's more overview with him. We only see glimpses of it with him. The rest of them all have very straightforward, they're not about life and death. They're different kinds of arcs.
Okay, let's stop here, and then after our break, we'll come back and talk about some of the main themes in this novel, including the importance of art. Okay, welcome back. In the first part of our discussion, we were talking about the different fiction elements in this novel. So, Yed, why don't you start us off with a discussion about theme or some other fiction elements that we haven't covered yet?
Yeah, I think what I want to talk about here is sensibility. And by sensibility, I mean the things that Mandel thinks are important and the themes that she thinks are worth addressing. For me, the irony of this novel is that even though she sends her characters through the collapse of human society and out into the wilderness, because of her very genteel narrative sensibility, they never really seem to enter the wilderness. They never escape civilization. I mentioned earlier, I can praise the novel because the storytelling is very nimble and it's very well paced, but what prevented me from really loving the novel is that I was always waiting for a genuine shock, some sort of a genuine respite from her oppressive good taste. Do you think that this is a valid complaint that I'm making, or am I asking too much?
Well, can you define what you mean by oppressive good taste?
What I mean is that I imagine Mandel to be a certain type of person and to hold certain values that I think are very broadly held by most. Here I'm going to be perhaps derogatory to certain people, but they're very broadly held by white, college-educated, middle and upper class sorts of people. And I think that it's good taste in the sense that it's the sort of thing that people who fit that demographic all generally agree on. To give you an example, in the story, religion and religious people become sort of the villains, and I think that that villainy operates on the taste that Mandel is banking on, that her reader is probably going to be an agnostic or atheist or some other non-fundamentalist variant in terms of religion, and it's easy to pick on religious people. But imagine a novel where, for example, the traveling Shakespeare company goes to Utah and they encounter a group of Mormon polygamists. And the conflict of the story is that they try to tell the polygamists that they shouldn't practice polygamy. And they actually become oppressors because they enter a society and try to change the society's rule. That, to me, would be a much more complicated story to tell and perhaps more interesting, just because it wouldn't be Mandel playing to the values of her proposed readership.
Sounds to me like you got a good fan fiction going there.
Possibly. I mean, I'm not really that much interested in polygamy in general, but I just think that if she took any group that, quote unquote, people like us don't necessarily empathize with and put them in the role of the victim or put them in the role of the protagonist, it would make a much more nuanced and complicated work that would challenge the reader.
So, Sam, did you feel the same way? Did you think that this book was too, quote, safe, or it represented the view of a certain kind of person?
Yes, I did feel like it was safe. And I don't mean that to disparage Mandel or her readers. Like you had said, this is a well-told story. It's paced pretty well. But I was never surprised by anything, really. I know it's not what she was going for, but in a story that is apocalyptic in setting, I was looking for more horrors. I was looking for more intense situations, and we don't really get very much of that. Supposed horrors of this new world are told to us off-page. They're not shown. Even the main villain is killed very quickly and quietly. It's not a very long scene compared to other things going on in the book.
Well, this is one reason, actually, to both of your points, why I think this is much more of a mystery novel in the mystery tradition than it is a sci-fi novel. Because in a lot of dystopic sci-fi fiction, I'm thinking of, like, for example, Oryx and Crake by Atwood. It ends still in a dystopia, but this has a happy ending. Like, when you reach the end, you feel very hopeful, right? Like, it's the rekindling of civilization. And what mystery novels are, essentially, is a restoration of order. some chaos has been conducted, someone's been murdered, and by the end of the book, you find out why they've been murdered, and that person has been brought to justice. So it's a kind of a safe restoration. It's a restoration of the status quo. I mean, that's the whole purpose of a mystery novel. But a sci-fi novel is very different because it's the exploration of what the status quo is, and maybe it can be subverted. But that's not what a mystery novel is. So this is another reason why I feel like this is so much more of a mystery novel. And it's in that tradition where if you're a mystery reader and you read this, you just think, oh yeah, like this is exactly what I expect from a book. Whereas if you're coming into this as a sci-fi reader, you might be a little bit disappointed.
James, do you think that this novel surprised you, either as a mystery reader or a sci-fi reader, as any type of reader? Was there anything here that surprised you and you thought Mandel wouldn't touch on that?
No, I thought it was distinctly lacking in subversion, which I found a little bit disappointing. If it wasn't a dystopian novel, let's just say instead of a dystopian novel, it's just, for some reason, it's a novel about Amish traveling Shakespearean actors, it would have all the same appeal and value. Like, it doesn't have to be a dystopian novel. When I say that, I mean in terms of what she's trying to say about art and what she's trying to say about what's valuable and important to us. Obviously, there are parts of this book that has its appeal because it's dystopian. But if you look at what she's trying to convey in terms of her theme about art or about what the world is like, I think you could have a similar story with a traveling Amish group.
Yeah. I mean, that fits with what I was saying earlier. I think that she has this theme of the value of art. And basically, it seems to me that her take is that art is very valuable to human beings. And I obviously share that position, but I think it would be much more interesting for the novel to articulate a position contrary to that. And I think that, ironically, articulating the contrary position would actually make her novel more artful than it is already, because basically she's preaching to a choir of readers who already share most of her values.
I think for me, it's not, because you're saying that because her opinions are too safe or it's not subversive, that's why it's not artistic, right? Is that what you're saying?
It can be subversive in the sense that it presents not necessarily a different position that nobody else has presented before, but rather a position that she imagines might be different from the people who are likely to read the novel.
I agree, but my response would be a little bit different. I think what's lacking here is she has this message that art is valuable, but I don't think it's ever challenged in the novel. So what I'd like to see is an exploration. I'd like to see people who say art is not valuable in the book. And then there's some actual tension in how the ideas are conveyed. I don't think the prophet is a suitable villain here because I don't think the opposite of what she's presenting is religion. Like you said, it's an easy villain here. And for me, a much better villain would be someone who puts forward the argument that art is not valuable, that survival is what's important.
Well, it's not just the art either, though. As Iad pointed out, they never escape civilization. There seems to be this fascination with a return to this pastoral way of living. And I think there is something to that, but it's not fully explored. I think that idea of the pastoral is overshadowed by the hopefulness that maybe we can build a connected world again. They never fully get it away from the mystique and the love for how the world was before.
We're talking a little bit now about whether or not this novel surprises us or subverts expectations, but do you think that a novel or a work of art being surprising or challenging the reader is related in any way in terms of the artistry that we find in that work?
I do. I mean, I don't think every work of art has to be challenging, but I think the challenging works of art are going to last longer. I think they're going to be held up and revered for longer. I don't see people coming back to this many years down the road because, like you said, it's not very challenging.
But here's a question for both of you. When the creator of a work challenges the audience in some way, does that challenge remain interesting in the long run? Because challenges are eventually met and surpassed. Do you think people in the future are interested in challenges just for their own sake, or does there need to be something more? Is there some other reason why challenging fiction is more desirable than safe fiction?
Isn't this a similar conversation to why abstract art is art? Right? Like, in order to understand it, you have to understand the context of the art. But if you don't understand the context, then you think, oh, it's just some scribbles or some paint thrown against a wall. Well, you're saying that the context of the subversive nature of art, or the context of how something is produced in that moment, is what makes it art, right?
I think it makes it art in the moment because it's so challenging, but hundreds of years later, if those challenges have been met, if we imagine, for example, a future where nearly all visual art is abstract art, it wouldn't seem to be a challenge unless you were an art historian or some other person who had access to the context to understand that at a particular moment in history, nearly all art was representational art.
So when you say challenge, you don't mean difficulty. What you mean is opposed to the norm, right?
It challenges in the sense that it prompts the audience to think of things in a way that's different from their normal way of thinking. So my criticism with Mandel's novel is that it doesn't prompt the audience to think about anything differently from the way that I presume they already are thinking.
Here's a comparison that's not fair, but it leapt to mind. Nabokov's Lolita is beautifully written. Just in the style, the way it's written elevates it quite a bit. But also the subject matter is very different. And the character of Humbert Humbert is not a good person, but he's fascinating. And his quote-unquote love affair with Lolita is very different and very challenging. It forces you to see through his eyes and think about things, even if you don't side with him. That is undeniably art.
I would push back a bit, Yed, in that I don't think that's the sole arbiter of someone's level of artistry. I don't think...
No, it's not sole arbiter, but was that Yed's question, though?
Let me rephrase. What I'm trying to get at here is there some distinction here between challenging work and work that just engages in things for shock value? And it seems to me that there is something that adds to artistry of a work that isn't just shock value. It's not just a mere shock. For me, in fiction at least, I think one of the most important things that the writer can do is to get the world of the novel to feel like it has its own reality, distinct from our reality. And that reality, that world, can be governed by whatever features the author thinks are necessary for the story. In terms of Station 11, the fault that I find with it is that there is no unexpected in the world of the novel. And because there is nothing unexpected, the world of the novel has no reality separate from our reality, only because we can see the world of the novel as being very contrived by Mandel's real-world sensibilities. It never distinguishes itself from our world. There is something to challenging fiction and challenging art in general beyond just the shock of the new. In fiction, my argument here is that being challenging and being subversive is not just some good that's super added on top of other goods in fiction, but something constitutive. It's very fundamental to fiction and world building.
Yeah, I think my argument is similar to yours, but not exactly the same. It's a sibling to your argument, let's say. in that I don't think the problem is that she's not being challenging enough, though I agree that there's a distinct lack of subversive elements here. I think the problem here is we actually don't know what she's saying about art beyond the fact that art is good. If we had a better idea, if we knew, okay, she's exploring art and art is this or art is that, it doesn't necessarily have to be challenging, but it's something we can grapple with. I just don't see anything we can grapple with on that idea level.
Over the course of this book, there was a sort of mantra that is held, especially by Kirsten. It became the mantra for the book for me, that survival is insufficient, which she takes from a Star Trek episode. But I also felt like there should be a second part to that sentence, and I wonder if that's where the art argument comes in. It's never explicitly stated, but I wonder what for you would be the rest of that mantra. If survival is insufficient, for me, I think she was trying to say that art will save humanity. But that's the second part of that sentence. But I don't know if that's a successful argument, and I don't know if that would be true for the two of you either. Is there a second part to that sentence, and what would it be for you?
I think here this goes back to what I was saying about Mandel's sensibility. I think that for Mandel and a lot of readers, there is an obvious kind of counterpoint to that thing that's written on her body and on the side of their wagon. Survival is insufficient. The implied second part is you need art to make survival worth it. I think that that's what Mandel is assuming she'll find in us, is that belief. But I don't think art is necessarily what makes life worth living. I think that for a lot of readers, yes, but somebody could be much more pessimistic and they could read that quote as something more like, existence isn't worth it. Living isn't worth it. And that wouldn't have a second part. That's just a very negative and nihilistic sort of reading of that quote. But I think that that's not what Mandel expects the reader to take from it.
No, I don't think so either. But it's interesting that you bring that up. I decided to watch that episode from Star Trek Voyager the other night because I didn't watch Voyager growing up. It never appealed to me. And it's dated, but that quote definitely takes on the more pessimistic view that you're talking about. That's what they're grappling with in the episode. But I agree that that's not the point of it here at all. I don't think it's a pessimistic view in the book. Certainly not by the end. By the end, it's this love affair with civilization and a hope and desire that they can bring civilization back.
I think if Mandel had leaned more heavily into this pessimistic reading, either through the protagonists or through some other characters, I would have engaged with the novel more. If they engaged with this sort of, you might want to call it like antinatalism in philosophy, is the idea that life and birth is not necessarily a good thing in and of itself. And while it's not the philosophical view that I hold, it's something to engage with that's more substantial. I think that it's assumed in the novel that life plus art is worth living, but why does life need art? Why is life in and of itself insufficient? That's the thing that I want to explore.
Well, yeah, and like one of you said, I don't remember if it was you or James, but
we are the Borg.
Yeah.
We've been assimilated.
That argument, or any argument, would mean more if there was a real antithesis to it in this book. But the only villain we get isn't a villain. Well, it challenges the survival is insufficient a little bit, but not completely. It's not a convincing argument against that mantra.
Yeah, I don't think I can make a convincing argument for how to end that saying. I think that goes to what I was saying earlier, where I don't think we are presented with enough evidence of anything, in terms of what she wants to say about art beyond art is good, which is so vague it doesn't mean anything to me. One thing I did think was interesting was, we talked previously about how a lot of dystopian novels use pandemics as a shortcut to get to a post-apocalyptic world. And I just thought it was interesting how she actually really goes into detail describing the initial effects of the pandemic. And I really related to that, being that we are, in COVID central here. I thought that was extremely well done. Maybe there's something there about survival, but it's just, I don't know. I didn't think too much about it because I was so taken with the description of people, dealing with the pandemic as it was unfolding. I didn't really think too much about it, but I think you could make an argument that she is making some gesture toward what survival means in that situation.
I think you're right that the impending loss as the pandemic was taking place, and then the experience of loss, both for people but also for the material culture of human society that was lost through the pandemic. Like, there is that profound sense of loss that you see most of the characters experiencing, which motivates Clark to build the Museum of Civilization in the airport. But I didn't feel like it really showed me anything new. I understand the sense of loss because I can imagine the things that I love and the people that I love being taken from me. I understand that, but it doesn't really add much to that experience by reading about it. For me, it was more of a kind of wallowing where you have these characters in this experience just kind of rolling around in their feelings of sadness because they don't have electricity and they don't have airplanes and telephones.
Yeah, I think I agree with you when we sort of move toward, like year 2 or year 3. But the most real part of the book for me was like 1 week after the outbreak, or like even the immediate day or two after the outbreak. Like, for example, when Miranda was dying of the flu, spoilers, she's like looking out at the ships and thinking some people will survive. Like, that for me was really real because it's her work. Like, her work is in shipping, but at the same time, it's her art that's her work, and that does survive. Like, that to me is where the artistry actually does shine through a bit.
Yeah, I think the cargo ships off the coast was a very interesting part of the novel that Mandel should have explored more, because they don't have a chance of being infected. Like, what happens to them?
Well, we do see, while we don't see that exactly, we do see the land equivalent. We get that in Severn City Airport. In the reverse, we have people leaving and never returning or getting sick outside of the airport. For example, Air Gradia?
Yeah, that's one of my favorite parts of the book, where they decide to quarantine and then you just have this plane full of ghosts.
What I loved about that was that it's not a decision that anyone in the book makes. It's not a decision made by the characters. It's a decision assumed was made by the people on the plane. So we only have people like Clark looking at this plane that hasn't moved, that purposely went as far away from the airport as it could. And so I think that mystery, yeah, I agree, that was one of the stronger points for me.
Maybe that's the closest we can get to some kind of subversion of good taste in the book.
She definitely purposely went away from the more chaotic things that we're used to in this type of book, in apocalyptic writing. I saw an essay that talked about The Road and Cloud Atlas and a couple others. I don't know if I agreed with everything the essay pointed out. They were very much on board on the Mandel train. But one thing I thought was interesting was that it does seem to eschew all of that, all of the chaos, like that she's not interested in that. That story has already been told, and she's trying to tell something different. But if that's the subversion, it's a pretty lackluster one.
I felt the same way. I thought the the way she kind of subverted our expectation is if you were a sci-fi reader coming into this, and I mentioned before something like Oryx and Crake, another dystopian novel, it ends with a very depressing ending. I mean, I don't want to give it away, but it's not a happy ending the way this is. I think that it is a subversion of a certain kind of sci-fi storytelling where you have a clearly defined villain. You don't have like a nebulous other. You have this kind of hopeful ending, this rebuilding. I mean, we don't see that in a lot of dystopian novels. I don't know if I like it, but it's definitely different.
Right. But that goes back to Iad's point about challenge and something truly subversive. I mean, it's subversive in the sense that it's different from those other works that we're referencing, but it's not challenging. Everyone is happy at the end. The people that die didn't die awfully, really.
Dieter was the one of the good guys who died, but I guess that was just included just to prevent it from being a little bit too clean. Because if it was only bad guys dying, I think Mandel would have realized, this is a little bit too safe.
Oh, Frank dies.
Frank dies. Miranda dies. Yeah, Dieter dies. But
well, I mean, after the pandemic,
right? But Dieter, I mean, was that important to you?
It wasn't. But what I'm trying to say is that if you have a conflict and you have a group of good guys and a group of bad guys, and all of the good guys survive and all of the bad guys die,
right?
It just feels a little bit too clean.
All right, let's take a break. And when we come back, we'll talk about the legacy of this book. All right, welcome back. So this book was published pre-COVID. Do you guys think there's any extra significance now that we are mid-pandemic? Do you think that reading this during the pandemic changes the experience for you?
Yes and no. The beginning did. The sections, specifically at the end of the first Jivan section, when things start happening, it felt very parallel. It felt like a more extreme version of COVID. And there were moments like when Jivan is hiding in Frank's apartment where it felt very similar, but again, like a more extreme version. But at the same time, it definitely felt like a fiction. There were parts that felt elevated, but in general, it still felt very fiction to me.
Yeah, I think this pandemic has really expanded Mandel's readership because not just us, a lot of people are looking for pandemic fiction. And it kind of reminds me of this skit from Chappelle's Show where Dave Chappelle gets a call from Oprah and Oprah tells him that she's pregnant with his baby and he celebrates. He's like, I'm rich. I can't imagine Mandel getting the news like there's this pandemic and her book sales are through the roof and she's like, I'm rich. Like, honestly, not to disparage Mandel, but COVID is doing a lot for her career.
But you know what, though? Like, I read an interview where she said she was surprised, or maybe she expressed it on Twitter, that she was surprised people would want to read her book, given that they are experiencing COVID. And I think that goes to her worldview, right? Like, she's someone who is essentially safe as a person, right? Mm-hmm. Like, she's like, why would anyone want to seek out something uncomfortable?
Yeah.
Like, I feel like it was that kind of tone.
That is funny considering how we're talking about how safe this is of a novel in general. But if you look at what people were watching at the beginning of the lockdown, on Netflix, it was all really horrific quarantine-based movies or pandemic-based movies. It wasn't lighthearted stuff. It was hot zone type things.
For as bad as COVID is, I still think that it's the sort of pandemic that the people in the novel expected the Georgia flu to be like. They thought it would last for a couple months and people would die, but most people wouldn't. Right. And they learned later on that it was much worse than that, and actually 99% of people died. So COVID is bad, but not as bad as the Georgia flu. So I think that there is sort of a feeling of safety when you're feeling that something is dangerous and you look at somebody who's experiencing something even more dangerous.
That resonated with me. Not your comment yet, but but the fact that like people thought it wasn't going to be that bad. That's kind of what it was like in the US, right? Like Sam, initially when it spread here, people had the same feeling. They thought, oh, it's in China, and then it's like, oh, it's in Iran, and it's like, oh, it's in Italy, and they just didn't think it would get that bad.
Yeah, I think I even admitted during our Pale Horse discussion that it sounded bad to me, but it didn't sound like it was as serious as it ended up being.
So because her career has had this boost due to COVID, do you think it's affected the legacy of this book at all? Do you think people will study this more because of COVID?
I don't think so. I think that it's a short-term thing, but if I'm honest, it's a very skillfully written thing, but it's not the sort of thing that I think people will look back to in the future as a testimony of our particular times. And if we abstract the novel from our particular times, I don't think it has any particular interest on its own terms. I think that it's a very, very good example of what it is, but what it is isn't the sort of thing that I think will last into the next century.
Yeah, I agree. I know it's not fair fully to compare it to the things we've discussed, the other books like sort of like this, like The Road or Blindness. But I think it's fair enough because they are in the same general category. And I think those types of books, the way the story is told and the language used and the perspective just ended up being more successful. And they're going to have a much more lasting legacy than this will. Unfortunately, because again, like Ed said, it is well told, but it's not deep enough or maybe dark enough for it to last.
I think it might get some traction with people in cultural studies. I could see essays being written about this, comparing this to other pandemic works, looking at people who might want to look at art pre and post pandemic. But I don't see it gaining a lot of traction with lit crit people. I guess let's just end with, did you find this book enjoyable?
Yeah, it was definitely an enjoyable thing to read. I think that, as I mentioned earlier, the Jivan chapters at the beginning weren't as good as the rest of the novel. If I were to give her notes before it was published, I would probably tell her that she should rearrange the beginning.
Well, would you have the Jivan character at all?
I think he has a place in the novel, but I thought at the beginning that he wasn't an especially interesting person. I was like, why are we following this boring guy,
Yeah, I thought it was I don't want to say enjoyable read, because I actually felt really stressed out when I was reading it, but I liked it. Like, it kept me entertained. I didn't want to stop reading it. So, in terms of reading it as a non-literary work, which sounds like I'm denigrating it, but I'm not. Like, I don't think there's any problem with non-literary fiction. Like, I thought it was really successful. Okay, well, now that we have a few interesting ideas for Ead's budding fanfiction career, let's conclude. Thank you for listening. If you have feedback for us, you can find us at Canonical Pod on Twitter and Facebook. And we also are on Reddit at Canonical Pod. So we'd love to hear from you, and we would love for you to join our discussion. We'll be back next episode with our series wrap-up on pandemic literature. If you're interested in following that discussion, just go ahead and listen to our previous episodes on Pale Horse, Pale Rider, and blindness. If you want to support us, you can use our affiliate link below. Till next time, happy reading, and we'll talk to you soon.